In order for students to be guided in certain career directions based upon society's needs, student profiles are an important part of certain school-to-work initiatives, and employers will have continual access to these profiles as part of a permanent file on all individuals who are now considered to be lifelong learners. In communist China, the file is called a dangan and describes the value of the individual to the state. Unfortunately, today, ladies and gentlemen, there seem to be similarities between school to work in the United States and the dangan in communist China. Critics, in fact, have compared Tucker's own Human Resources Development, or HRDP, to the Chinese communist dangan, a file describing the value of the individual to the state. In a New York Times article, Personal File and Worker Yoked for Life, dated March 16, 1992, it says that the dangan contains political evaluations that affect career prospects. Tucker's HRDP does not advocate that political evaluations be included in the fully computerized integrated labor market database he proposes. However, he does say the cradle to grave. Wow, where have you heard that before? This is the first open admission. That's a direct quote right out of the HRDP. Cradle to grave. HRDP system is, quote, outcome and performance based, is for everyone, and would contain their qualifications. People's qualifications could include whether they receive a certificate of initial mastery, called CIM, which could include such potentially politically correct categories as involved citizen, perhaps whether they've performed community service, constructive thinker, collaborative contributor, boy is that loaded, understands diversity, and interprets human experience, end quote, which are all actual categories on Oregon's CIM, which is the Certificate of Mastery, Certificate of Initial Mastery, I should say. Tucker's HRDP would also include everyone's employment histories for their entire lifetime, as everyone would be, quote, lifelong learners, end quote, if not lifelong workers. Remember, I told you this years ago. Got all kinds of mail telling me I was a kook, that this could never happen, that they could never make the school the center of the community and force everybody to go to school from birth to grave, from cradle to grave. But that's exactly what they're going to do. And that's exactly what's outlined in all of this stuff. That's exactly what they say, right out of their own mouth, folks. I didn't make any of this up. In Mark Tucker's post-election letter to Hillary Clinton, outlining his human resources development program, he wrote of the need to create an, quote, employment service, end quote. And this is what he said, quote, all available frontline jobs, whether public or private, must be listed in it. The employment service, by law, this provision must be carefully designed to make sure that employers will not be subject to employment suits based on the data produced by this system. If they are subject to such suits, they will not participate, end quote. Of course, Tucker's concern about lawsuits suggests that there will be personal information or evaluations included in everyone's files regarding their qualifications and employment histories, and I'm going to tell you right now, there will be a political category. Regarding the Chinese Communist dangan, students and workers are never allowed to see their files. But as the quoted New York Times article states, quote, they live all their lives with their files looming over them, end quote. Similar to Tucker's HRDP, the dangan is kept, quote, on virtually everyone except peasants, end quote, and is filled with, quote, performance evaluations, end quote, and stays with the individual, quote, for a lifetime, end quote. How would you like to be shackled with that? Well, your children are going to be, if you don't do something about it. If you've got National Education Association teachers and administrators in your schools, your children are going to be taught to be good little socialist human resources in the New World Order. You can translate that as, quote, slaves, end quote. The article goes on to say, quote, a file is opened on each urban citizen when he or she enters elementary school, and it shadows the person throughout life, moving on to high school, college, and employer. The Dan-Gan affects the promotions and job opportunities, and it is difficult to escape from because any prospective employer is supposed to examine an applicant's Dan-Gan before making a hiring decision. The Dan-Gan is part of a web of social controls that ensure order in China. Regarding the use of the word web in the article, it is worth noting that in Tucker's letter to Hillary Clinton, he wrote, quote, we think the great opportunity you have is to remold the entire American system for human resources development. What is essential is that we create a seamless web of opportunities to develop one's skills that literally extends from cradle to grave and is the same system for everyone, young and old, poor and rich, worker and full-time student, end quote. The term seamless web also appears in a February 1994 UNESCO publication entitled Culture and Development, a Study, which described, quote, human development, end quote, and stated, quote, development is a seamless web, end quote, and, quote, the way in which education trains people for work is a criterion of its relevance, end quote. Pursuant, ladies and gentlemen, to the 1996 Welfare Reform Act on October 1st, 1997, President Clinton inaugurated the National Directory of New Hires. As the New York Times reported on September 22nd, 1997, the directory is not just for welfare recipients. That is, the directory is not just for welfare recipients. Here's what it says, quote, it will record basic information, including names, addresses, social security numbers, and wages to be reported every 3 months for everyone hired after October 1st for a full or part-time job by any employer of any size, end quote. It has begun. Ostensibly designed to facilitate the tracking down of deadbeat dads who move out of state to avoid paying child support, the directory just happens to be tailor-made for the school-to-work planners, since it creates a file on American workers which is updated every 3 months. The New York Times adds that much more information is likely to end up in the files. Before the program has even begun, some states were already requiring the filing of telephone numbers, dates of birth, driver's license numbers, and health insurance information. And if you don't think workers' evaluations are far behind, you'd better think again. The New York Times also quoted privacy expert Robert M. Gelman, quote, the government is creating a gigantic new database with very broad uses and very little attention paid to the protection of personal privacy, end quote. Gelman predicted that Congress would expand the number of people authorized to use the new directory, just as it has done with other, quote, protected, end quote, information over the years. Remember what they said when they passed the Social Security law, making the Social Security tax? They said it was voluntary and that the number would never be used for identification or for any other purpose other than Social Security. You see how they lie, ladies and gentlemen? As an example of how school-to-work federal funds come into a state, North Carolina is receiving $30 million in school-to-work monies from the United States Department of Labor. It goes to the state's Workforce Preparedness Commission, appointed by Governor James B. Hunt, Jr., until recently vice chairman of NCEE, and then down to the local level. Politics can play a role in who is appointed to the local partnership councils, whose plans have to be approved by regional workforce development boards and also at the state level. Thus, there really is no local control at all period, end of subject. Out of your hands. School to Work, Job Ready is not a voluntary program, as all students will have to participate in it regardless of what they have told you. According to the Governor's Commission on Workforce Preparedness, quote, the Commission proposes the elimination of the general track requiring all students to be enrolled in a job-ready program, end quote. They don't care what the student wants. They don't care what's good for the student. Students will be channeled into what is good for the state or business, period. Once your child is channeled, that ends all other hopes that he or she or you as parents may have ever had for your children. Also, many will find objectionable the Commission's statement that, quote, companies involved in School to Work will have the opportunity to grow their own employees, and the job-ready system will ensure that every North Carolina employer is an equal partner with parents in the education of young people, end quote. The Commission report goes on to state that during grades 6 through 8, all students will develop career plans. The program here is that many students 11 to 13 years of age do not know what their careers will be. Although Job Ready permits students to change their career plans after the 8th grade now, won't be that way in the future. Many students will be reluctant to do this because they would fall behind other students of the same age who were not changing career paths. Because it means to graduate, they would have to demonstrate proficiency in their new career field. That means starting again at square one. Even proponents of School to Work occasionally admit that their system is a thinly veiled form of social engineering. Well, what else could it be? Prepared by, implemented by, and put into action and supervised by Marxist, Socialist, National Education Association teachers and administrators. On July 19, 1995, the California State Senator Bill Leonard wrote a letter to California State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Delane Easton, a supporter of President Clinton's national education standards. This letter concerned the statements of Douglas Renwick, a member of the state's School to Career Curriculum Framework and Criteria Committee. According to Senator Leonard, Renwick had made the following comment at a recent committee meeting, quote, by design, we are doing social engineering. We're using education to consciously invent the future of our culture and society. Let's get to it and acknowledge what we're doing, end quote. Senator Leonard went on to write that, quote, Mr. Renwick also stated that Hitler's Nazis gave social engineering a bad name and implied that if good people were the engineers, then social engineering would be acceptable, end quote. Isn't that strange? I'll bet you Hitler's social engineers said something almost exactly, word for word, the same thing. You see, Hitler was a socialist. Nazi means National Socialist German Workers' Party.